Hello, dear student. Welcome to another course. This time it's going to be syntax. So this course is going to be about syntax, and this course is based on Carnie's book. Okay, Carnie 2013, and in this video we'll be dealing with the first chapter, generative grammar. All right, so we're going to talk about language with capital L, okay, uh, and language with lowercase l. So we have language, or also is called I language. So the language with capital L is I language, okay, uppercase. L is the human capacity for language. That is our ability to speak any particular language. So when we talk about language, or what Chomsky means by I language, is the ability, is our capacity for speaking language, or capacity or ability to speak language. Any human being is born with some genetic capacity that helps them to speak any language they are exposed to. So that ability to speak any language is what Chomsky refers to as I language, or language with capital L. And language with small l, or lowercase l, or as Chomsky refers to, E language, refers to an instantiation, okay, an instantiation of this ability. So everyone has language with capital L. Everyone has this ability to speak language, and everyone speaks a particular language. So when we talk about language with small l, we're talking about uh, French, English, Arabic, and other languages. So we're talking about the instantiation of this ability. So do you see the difference? Capital L, we're talking about the ability to speak any language. Okay, language with small l, we're talking about about speaking a particular language like French, English, Arabic, and other languages. Now, the first subchapter in Carney's book is syntax as a cognitive science. So, cognitive science is a covered term for a group of disciplines that all aim for the same goal. That is, describing and explaining human beings' ability to think, particularly to think about abstract notions. Okay, so the goal of cognitive science is to account for how humans think about, you know, how is their ability to think about abstract notions. Okay, so the goal is to describe and explain these things. And what distinguishes us, okay, from animals, okay, is our ability to use productive language. Language plays an important role in how we think about abstract notions. Okay, so cognitive science, as you can see, uh, its goal first is to explain how human beings think about abstract notions, and how, or what distinguishes us from animals. Okay, so of course it's language that distinguishes animals, and we're going to see how to account for this. Sentences are how we get at expressing abstract thought process. So the study of syntax is important for understanding how we communicate and interact with each other as humans. Now, let's see with modeling syntax. This is the subchapter 2, the section 2. So the dominant theory of syntax is due to Noam Chomsky and his colleagues, starting in the mid 50s and continuing to this day. The theory has had many different names through its development. Okay, so the theory of syntax is referred to as transformational grammar, TG. Transformation generative grammar, okay, TGJ, standard theory, extended standard theory, government and binding theory, principles and parameters approach, okay, and minimalist, which is the last term used in syntax. So these are the terms that are used to uh, that are used or have been used by Chomsky and his colleagues for the theory of syntax. The understanding or the underlying thesis of generative grammar is that sentences are generated by a subconscious set of procedures. So these procedures are part of our minds. You see, you can come up with an unlimited number of sentences based on some, procedures, based on some uh, rules. These procedures are part of our mind. The goal of syntactic theory is to model these procedures. In other words, through syntactic theory, we can figure out what we subconsciously know about the syntax of our language. So in generative grammar, the means for modeling this procedure is through a set of formal grammatical rules. These rules are thought to generate the sentences of a language, hence the name generative grammar. So generative grammar, as the name suggests, it is based on the fact that we generate, okay, sentences based on certain rules. You're going to see. So if we look at the rules of grammar, for example, we have, for example, nouns, we have verbs, adverbs, adjectives. Okay, we know that the subject in English comes first, and then verb, and then object, for example. So we can, based on these rules that are limited, we can come up with an infinite number of sentences, unlimited number of sentences. That is why what it is called generate. So we generate sentences based on rules. Syntax as a science, the scientific method. Syntax is the scientific study of language structure. That is, the rules that determine how words combine into phrases and sentences. So this is the definition of syntax. It studies the how words are combined to form sentences and phrases. Okay, so it is scientific. We're going to see how it is scientific. What makes syntax uh, as a science? What makes it a science? It is scientific in the sense that it goes through the same scientific methods or method that other sciences go through to build theories. We're not talking about other sciences. We're talking about hard science, for example, like physics, maths, and biology or geology. So to build theory in these fields, you go through some certain scientific method. The same scientific method these sciences go through, also syntax goes through. The scientific method we're talking about here is, for example, we start with observing data. So you observe the data, okay? Then you make generalization. You generalize those data. You think of the pattern that we have there, and you make some generalizations. And then you develop hypothesis, okay? Once you develop hypothesis, you test that hypothesis against more data. So you collect more data and you test your hypothesis against those data or that data, and then you revise the hypothesis to account for any new data, and then you test data again. Okay, and that's how you build the theory. When you go through these method or these procedures, as you can see, then at the end you build your theory. In syntax, we apply this methodology to sentence structure. Some syntacticians start by observing data about the language they are studying. Okay, then they make generalization about the patterns in the data. They then generate a hypothesis. preferably one that makes predictions, and test the hypothesis against more syntactic data, and if necessary go back and reevaluate, okay, their hypothesis. So hypotheses are only useful to the extent that they make predictions. Okay, based on hypothesis, you predict. You predict. Uh, and the hypothesis that makes no predictions is useless from a scientific perspective. In particular, the hypothesis must be falsifiable. That is, we must in principle be able to look for some data which, if true, show that the hypothesis is wrong. This means that we are often looking for the cases where our hypothesis predicts that the sentence will be grammatical and it is not, or the cases where they predict that the sentence will be grammatical but it is. Okay, so the hypothesis should be falsifiable in the sense that you should predict, okay, predict something in the data, okay, predict a sentence or something in the data that is true, but the hypothesis, according to hypothesis, is false, or the other way around. That's why this is the hypothesis that is good in that is good in science, or from the scientific perspective. Okay, should always has this prediction which could be true or false. In syntax, hypotheses are called rules, and the group of hypotheses that describe the language's syntax is called grammar. Okay, so grammar is a group of hypotheses that describe a language or language's syntax. Let's move on to an example of the scientific method as applied to syntax and anaphors, or as applied to syntax. And we are talking here, we are going to apply the scientific method uh, on anaphors. So anaphor is a noun that ends with self. For example, himself, herself, themself. This is, or yourself. This is an anaphor. Okay, and an antecedent is the noun that an anaphor refers to. Okay, so we'll talk himself. Himself, for example, refers to him in the sentence, to someone. That's the antecedent. Look at the example. We have Bill kissed himself. Okay, himself is an anaphor, and Bill is antecedent. Bill is what an anaphor refers to in the sentence. You see, Bill. Okay, so this is, look for example at Bill kissed herself. This hypothesis is falsifiable. Okay, that is, here it's not correct. As you can see, Bill kissed herself is wrong. Okay, we're going to see why. The hypothesis one: an anaphor must have an antecedent and agree in gender with its antecedent. You see, when we talked about Belle kissed herself, herself does not refer to Belle. Okay, so this or herself, this anaphor does not agree in gender with its antecedent. So the first hypothesis should be like this: an anaphor must have an antecedent. That's our first hypothesis, and it should agree in gender with its antecedent. Let's see, let's test this hypothesis. For example, we have Gary and Kevin ran himself into exhaustion. Okay, so this is a sentence. We're going to see what's wrong with this sentence. Of course, it is incorrect. It is ungrammatical. Why? And we're going to revise our hypothesis. This is how building theory, or building theory, yes, I mean goes through. This is how it goes through. You should the hypothesis should be falsifiable, should predict, and the predictions could be true or false, and then uh, you keep correcting and revising your hypothesis until the end, until you build a theory. So the first hypothesis is that the antecedent or anaphor must have an agreement with its antecedent and agree in gender with it. Okay, it should have antecedent and agree with it. That's first. But Gary and Kevin run himself into exertion. Now, an anaphor must, hypothesis number two, an anaphor must have an antecedent, right? And agree in gender, masculine, feminine, of course, and number with this antecedent. So Gary and Kevin run himself into exertion. The anaphor here agrees with, of course, it has antecedent, and it agrees with the antecedent in terms of gender, but not in terms of number. So to correct our hypothesis, we should add this. An anaphor must have first an antecedent and agree in gender, okay, and number with this antecedent. So this is the correction of our hypothesis. Like we revised our hypothesis and we gave a new one. Now let's keep moving. He hit myself with a hammer. Okay, this hypothesis also is wrong, so we need to revise our hypothesis. Okay, then we come up with the hypothesis number three. An anaphor must agree in person, gender, and number with its antecedent. In this sentence, he hit myself with a hammer. It agrees, or the anaphor agrees with its antecedent in gender, in number, but not in person. Okay, so we need to revise our theory and include person in our hypothesis. So now we have a hypothesis that seems to account for the data concerning anaphors in English. Now we have revised our hypothesis three times, as you can see, three hypotheses, and we come up with a third hypothesis that can account for all the data concerning anaphors in English. Let's see, we have in this section, we have sources of data. So if we are going to apply the scientific method to syntax, it is important to consider the sources of our data. One obvious source is in collections of either spoken or written text. Such data are called corpora, singular corpus. So for languages without a literary tradition or one spoken by a small group of people, it is often necessary for the linguist to go and gather data and to compile a corpus in the field. So this is how you to collect data. You need a source. The source here is uh, the corpora that we collect. Okay, or linguists, of course, collect. So while corpora are unquestionably an invaluable source of data, they are only a partial representation of what goes on in the mind. Most of the time, they contain few ungrammatical sentences. So when a linguist wants um, to build a theory, they go and they collect data before it is it is worked on. It is just still a corpora, that is it's just information, not or not worked on. The linguist here has not yet worked on those data. Okay, so which is just still a corpora. Okay, that is, it is still full of grammatical and ungrammatical sentences, etc. So in order to know the range of acceptable sentences of any language, we first have to know what are not acceptable sentences in that language. This kind of negative information is not usually present in corpora, which mostly provide grammatical or well-formed sentences. Consider the following English sentences. Who do you wonder what bought? Of course, this sentence is grammatical. A, we have, who do you think bought the bread machine? This sentence is grammatical. I wonder what Fiona bought. So most native speakers of English will consider one as ungrammatical, but those into as okay, as grammatical. So the native speakers, if you give these sentences to a native speaker, they would tell you, even if though they don't know, I mean, even if they are not students or they are illiterate, even if you consider just a layman, okay, an illiterate person in the street, and then you give them these sentences, they will be able to tell you or to distinguish between these sentences. As, for example, who do you wonder what bought as wrong? For example, I would say it's wrong. It's not accepted in our language. We don't say that. Okay, but A and B in number two would they would tell you that these sentences are okay. These sentences we use them. They're fine. So how do they know that? They rely on their subconscious knowledge as native speakers of English to determine what is grammatical and what is not in the language. So they rely on their subconscious knowledge, their tacit knowledge as native speakers. Okay, when they learn first language, they learned it this way. Okay, they learned it in a systematic way in which they could tell or can tell what is in grammatical and what is not in their language. So the psychological experiment used to get this subconscious kind of knowledge is called the grammaticality judgment task. Okay, this grammaticality judgment task, the judgment task involves asking a native speaker. So you ask a native speaker to read a sentence, okay, and you judge whether it is well formed, meaning grammatical, marginal well formed, or L format, that is unacceptable or ungrammatical. So this grammatical judgment task is a way of how to get you know this knowledge from native speaker. If you want to build a theory, this is the way you ask. This is the way you gather data concerning whatever you are working on. Now, where do the rules come from? We have been talking about the subconscious knowledge of syntactic rules. If we know how children acquire the rules, then we are in a better position to develop a proper formalization of them. The way in which children develop knowledge is an important question in cognitive science. Okay, so the theory of generative grammar makes some very specific and very surprising claims about this, which are okay, so we have learning and acquisition. So here, basically, what we have here is that uh, to account for the rules, so we need to know how children acquire them. Okay, so to account for language, how uh, children acquire language, this would help us a lot to build a theory of grammar. Okay, so learning and acquisition. Conscious knowledge, like the rules of algebra, syntactic theory, principles of organic chemistry, or uh, how to take apart a carburetor, is learned. Okay, so these, for example, we're talking about here learning and acquisition. So learning here, when when you learn the rules of algebra, you learn mathematics, you learn something that is, for example, principles of organic chemistry. That's learning. These skills are learned. But subconscious knowledge, like how to speak or the ability to visually identify discrete objects, is acquired. So basically, we're talking about the dichotomy of learning and acquisition. Learning is some like a skill that you learn. You have some instructions, you have rules, and then you just learn them. But like ability to speak, this is something we learn naturally in the street. Okay, that's something we call, or that's something we call acquisition. Now we have innateness, language as an instinct. Probably the most controversial claim about Noam Chomsky is that language is also an instinct. Many parts of language are built in or innate. Much of language is an ability hardwired into our brains by our genes. So, in generative grammar, Chomsky claims that children are born with a capacity, okay, to learn language. They are pre-wired, okay. Our brains are pre-wired, okay, genetically to learn a language. This is something we were born with. It's an instinct. Human facility for language organ in the brain. That is, we are talking about the language with big L, the ability to speak. Okay, language is innate. We call this facility universal grammar. That is, human beings are born with universal grammar. This universal grammar that we are born with, which is in our mind, which is pre-wired, okay, helps us to learn any language. Argument for this fact, that is, argument for universal grammar, argument for the fact that we are born with something which is called universal grammar that helps us to acquire any language. Okay, so we're going to see some of them. An argument that is directly related to the logical problem of language acquisition discussed above has to do with the fact that we know things about the grammar of our language that we couldn't possibly have learned. Okay, we know that some grammatical, for example, if you are given a sentence, as we have seen earlier, if you are given a sentence about your language, you could say that this sentence is wrong, this sentence is right. Okay, you have some very abstract and high rules, but you don't know, you didn't learn, so you feel like you don't know how you know that, you just know it. Okay, to claim that overt instruction by parents plays any role in language development is usually falsified. Okay, so the fact that, okay, parents, when raising their children, the give them some rules, they correct their grammar, is easily falsified. How? The evidence from the experimental language acquisition literature is very clear. Parents, despite their best intentions, do not, for the most part, correct ungrammaticality or ungrammatical sentences by their children. So even if we think that parents constantly correct their children's language, but in fact they don't. Okay, so they don't really correct, they just go with it. Okay, you don't always correct your children's grammar or your children's language. More generally, they correct the content rather than the form of their children's utterances. So they correct the meaning of what they want to say, but not exactly the form or how their utterance is uttered. So when a parent does to try to correct a child's sentence structure, it is more often than not ignored by the child. We're going to see a conversation between a child and his father from Pinker, 1950 or 1995. This is a conversation between a father in real life, of course, between a father and his child. So one other one spoon, daddy, something like this. Okay, one other one spoon, daddy. You mean you want the other spoon? Yes, I want other one spoon, please, daddy. Can you say the other spoon? Other one spoon. Say other spoon, spoon, other spoon. Now give me the other. So give me other one spoon. You see, doesn't matter how the father, tries to correct his children's language, the children always keep repeating themselves repeating the same mistakes. Okay, so this is typical of parental attempts to instruct their children in language. When these attempts do occur, they fail. Mostly parents fail. However, children still acquire language in the face of complete lack of instruction. Perhaps one of the most convincing expression for this is UG. So even though parents try do their best, for example, in some cases, to correct their children's grammar, children keep repeating the same mistake, as you can see in this this example. But at the end, children come to speak their language properly. I mean, if you look at a child in 4 or 3, maybe before they make mistakes, but at the end they master their language uh, properly and no mistakes anymore. But that's not because their parents corrected their language, which seems from this example that they fail. But maybe the plausible explanation for this is the UG, something that they have in the mind that helps them to adapt, okay, their language and speak it properly at the end, which is more convincing. Now, 5, we have chosen among theories about syntax. How do we know what is good hypothesis and what is a bad one? Okay, Chomsky in 1965 proposed that we can evaluate how good theories of syntax are using what are called uh, the levels of adequacy. Through these levels of adequacy, we can say or we can claim that okay, a certain hypothesis is good, this hypothesis is good, and the other one is bad. Okay, we're going to see the 3 levels of adequacy that are very important in syntax, which everyone needs to know. So the first theory is observational adequacy or observably adequate. Okay, a theory that is observably adequate, it only accounts for the data in the corpus and nothing more. Okay, so when a theory or observational adequacy is a theory that accounts for the data, okay, in the corpus, it only counts for the data in the corpus before or before, I mean, the data is worked on, and we're going to see the rest of levels, um, how these are connected. Okay, so observational adequate theory is a theory that only accounts. Okay, it does nothing more. Only accounts for the data in the corpus, nothing more. A theory that accounts for both corpora and native speaker judgment about well-formedness is called descriptive adequate grammar. You see, so the observational adequacy theory or adequate theory is a theory that only accounts for the data, and then descriptive adequate grammar or theory is a theory that accounts for both, okay, accounting for the corpora and native speaker judgment about well-formedness. You see, so the descriptive adequate grammar includes in it observational adequate grammar. Okay, so the first one only accounts for the data of the in the corpus. The second one accounts for both the data and native speaker judgment about the fullness of sentences, etc. The third theory that also accounts for, so this theory is in syntax is the best. A theory that accounts for how children acquire their language is an explanatory, okay, adequate or explanatorily adequate grammar, explanatory adequacy. So these levels of adequacy, we have observational adequacy, descriptive adequacy, and explanatory adequacy. These 3 are very important to evaluate what, whether a hypothesis is good or bad. So this kind of theory is the best. Generative grammar strives towards explanatorily adequate grammar, okay, to account for how children acquire their language, because if we know this, then it would be better and easy to account for the rules of language, etc. Thank you very much for your attention. This is the source of this video or of this lesson, which is about generative grammar. it is in Carnie's book, okay, Andrew Carnie, 2013 Syntax: A Generative Introduction. And thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed and learned from the video, and catch you guys in the next video.